Very warm welcome to you all this morning. My name is Dominic Brett and I work here for the European Parliament's Liaison Office. We're the co-organisers of today's event, which is one of a number we put on here at Europe House throughout the year. I'd first like to extend our heartfelt thanks to our consistently excellent partners for this event, the European Institute at University College London, and particularly Dr. Ute Steiger and Dr. Claudia Sternberg, with whom we've enjoyed many years of fruitful collaboration, and we hope that will continue long into the future. It's particularly heartwarming to see so many of you here today, particularly with so much happening politically and the festive season upon us. We trust that your effort to attend will be rewarded by what we think will be an excellent discussion today. Before we kick off, let me say a few words, if I may, about the Sakharov Prize for Freedom of Thought. It was set up in 1988 to honour people and organisations defending human rights and fundamental freedoms. Each winner has their own unique history, of course, but all share common ideals such as religious liberty and tolerance, media freedom and the rule of law. The first winners were Nelson Mandela and the Soviet dissident Anatoly Marchenko. This year the award went to the Uyghur economist and human rights activist Ilham Tohti, and he will receive his prize next month in Strasbourg. Earlier this week, last year's winner, Oleg Sentsov, the Ukrainian film director and rights activist, was finally able to come to Strasbourg to pick up his award after his release in September from imprisonment in Russia, during which he was on hunger strike for nearly 5 months. All the European Parliament's liaison offices in the member states mark the Sakharov Prize with an event in November or December each year. It is not, as you'll have gathered from what I just said, necessarily linked to the field of endeavour of the winner in any given year. But we think our choice of a discussion on climate rights as human rights is a popular and timely one, and the gratifying turnout in the hall today suggests that you do too. So without further ado, I'll hand you over now to our moderator, Emma Nelson. Hi, Emma. I hope you enjoyed the discussion and have come ready with many fine questions for our panel. If any of you are here representing organisations which might be interested in co-hosting an EU-related event with us in 2020, do get in touch with us after the discussion. Emma.
Thank you very much indeed, Dominic, and thank you all for coming. It's good to see so many faces here in the middle of a rather busy time, especially politically. I'm also delighted to see that all our panellists have turned up and we didn't need to ring anybody to carve us any ice sculptures. This week's headlines have been dominated by climate change, whether it is the warning that the Paris Agreement was perhaps a little too late, whether it's the European Parliament declaring a climate emergency, or whether it is the promise of a European Green Deal in the next few years. We are in a world which has been described as the era of Greta Thunberg. We have a 16-year-old girl's single voice galvanising humanity, and arguably the big organisations responsible for looking after our climate are taking a little time to catch up. I find it slightly ironic that we're discussing climate change within the EU, an organisation founded to ease the movement of fossil fuels in 1951. But that agreement came about at a time when the world needed to come together to solve a problem, namely to stop another war happening. We have what some people are saying is an equally grave situation now, and it is a problem that requires more than one state to work together to deal with it. Which is why human rights play such a big part, because although human rights cross borders, the first people that feel consequences of it are citizens, whether it is being unable to grow crops, finding that their world is hotter than it should be, and even, indeed, having to leave and move. So let me introduce today's panel. To my right, I have Irina von Wiese. She's an MEP representing the Liberal Democrats here in London. We have Sophia Dievik-Henke, who works at the UK's Student Climate Networks, where you make film and you lobby governments and businesses and the private sector on climate change. You are the voice of our future, Sophia. No pressure there. Lisa van Halle is a political scientist whose research focuses on the rule of law, the role of law, and norms in political life. I'm sure you'll explain what that means in a minute. And her current research projects are on climate change litigation, Is that right? The governments of the impacts of climate change. We also have with us Sophie Moraniak, a lawyer and climate accountability lead for Client Earth, which is a charity that uses the power of the law to protect the planet and those who live on it. And finally, Scott Ainsley is an MEP representing the Green Party here in London. His priorities are taking climate action to deliver net zero carbon by 2030. Each of our panellists will make a short speech for about 7 minutes, and there'll be a few questions, and then we shall open up the debate to the floor. Please feel free to put your hands up. We will make sure that we will try and get as many people heard as possible. At the end, each panellist, I'm giving you the job now, come up with a good, simple fix, please, by lunchtime, because there will be lunch. We do have a few house rules as well. This is not a highly political space, if you don't mind, today. We're not here to score points. Please leave any Brexit arguments and election arguments at the door. They are not welcome in this space today. But please tweet and retweet. The hashtag is @SakharovUK. Your spelling is up there for those of you who need it. And EP in UK is a good tweet as well, European Parliament in UK. We are also live on Facebook. So please don't say anything out loud that you wouldn't want your mum to hear. Okay? So, may I begin by introducing our first speaker, Irina von Wiese.
Thank you very much, Emma, and thank you everybody who came here today. My own daughter, who is 15, told me that she found it more important to be out in Parliament Square to protest against the climate emergency than to come here, which is understandable. So thank you for coming here today. I am very proud to be a member of the European Parliament. I was elected in May of this year. I represent London. And as you've heard yesterday, the European Parliament passed 2 resolutions in which they declared that there is indeed a climate emergency. There was a lot of debate about the term. And personally, I'm very glad that it is called climate emergency today. And we passed 2 resolutions which send a very strong signal also to the summit in Madrid next week, I think, on the position of the European Union. And as you may know, we have the target of eliminating carbon emissions by 2050, which is an ambitious target given that we need to get all 28 member states to become carbon neutral by that date, and that is far beyond what some of the member states are aiming for individually. So there is a lot to do, and we're tackling this work. So that's the first thing. I'm also very privileged to be the Vice Chair of the Human Rights Committee in the European Parliament. So my background is in law. I am not a climate expert. So if you have any specific environmental or climate technical questions, then I'm probably not the right person to answer them. But I wanted to focus a little bit here on this interdependence between human rights and what you termed in the title of this event, I think quite rightly, climate rights. And these two are linked in 2 ways. The first one is an immediate infringement on human rights through the destruction of environmental habitat. And this is unfortunately something that we see again and again across the globe, where, and obviously the most important example of this is the recent devastating forest fires in Brazil, where the natural space was destroyed, particularly for the indigenous people of the Amazon region, and this is a direct threat to their lives and livelihoods, and clearly this is a direct infringement of human rights. We see this not just in Brazil, we sadly see this in many countries around the globe, and it is not just deforestation, but of course rising ocean levels have already led to the destruction of habitat, human habitat, particularly in the Pacific, but also other regions, low-lying regions. And what we will see in the future, of course, is directly climate-related migration. We already have that, but I believe this is going to be one of the biggest drivers of migration and refugee issues in the future. And I think this is something that we will discuss further. The second aspect is the increasing criminalization and clampdown on environmental activists that we see. Again, this is something that's happening systematically as a pattern across the world, independent really of whether we have a left-wing or a right-wing regime. We see the same thing outside the EU, but also in the EU. Let me give you a few examples. In Brazil, one of the nominees of this year's Sakharov Prize, indeed, is an indigenous Brazilian who was an environmental activist, first and foremost, and was arrested and subject to incrimination, to torture, and repression because of his environmental activism. But we also see the same thing in countries such as Mexico, in the Philippines, where there was a crackdown on environmental activists, including one of the special rapporteurs for indigenous people to the United Nations. Venezuela, where we recently talked to an indigenous leader whose village was attacked and 40 people were shot because they opposed the mining, the gold mining, by the Venezuelan government and a number of overseas corporations. We have seen that environmental activists have increasingly been called terrorists and accused of terrorist-related crimes. This was the case in France in the run-up to the Paris Climate Change Agreement. It was the case in Romania, where last month, 2 environmental activists were arrested, 200 in the last year, if I remember the numbers correctly. So governments across the globe are using labels such as terrorism and anti-terrorist legislation to crack down on environmental activists, and in order to pursue their political goals, but also to facilitate things such as open coal mining, gold mining, oil drilling, and other activities. For me, it doesn't, as a human rights lawyer, it doesn't really make much of a difference what a human rights defender was fighting for. As I said earlier, environmental rights are now very closely linked to basic human rights. Access to clean water, for example, in Mexico, is a fundamental right, particularly for the indigenous people who tend to be the most vulnerable and the ones that are targeted first, partly because they tend to live in areas where natural resources are still to be found and exploited. So these two topics are now increasingly interlinked, and I don't think we can really look at human rights and human rights protection without looking at the protection of the environment and without looking at the protection of environmental activists. I think I'll leave it at that. Hopefully that'll give you some food for thought, and obviously happy to welcome questions.
Irina, thank you very much indeed. I'm sure you will get some questions. Sophia Divik-Henke, the floor is yours.
Thank you. Yeah, so firstly, I'd just like to say thank you for inviting me to this event. It's an absolute honour to be here. So as Emma said, I'm a member of the UK Student Climate Network, the British branch of the Fridays for Future movement. The organisation was inspired by Greta Thunberg's activism, and we hope to radically transform the power of young people in national action against climate change. It's exciting to be able to represent the youth perspective on an issue that is, and will come to, dramatically affect youth all around the world. The Student Climate Network's first and most important demand is save the future. The government should declare a climate emergency and implement a Green New Deal to achieve climate justice. The government has indeed declared a climate emergency, as did the European Parliament yesterday, and ideas around the Green New Deal are rapidly crystallizing. In contrast, the concept of climate justice is still very far from being achieved. The climate justice movement puts human rights at the heart of both climate action and global development. Climate justice recognizes the rights of communities vulnerable to climate change, demands investment from high-income countries into such communities, and aims to ensure inclusive and diverse decision-making on climate action. Climate justice ultimately aims to address the paradox that those who have contributed least to greenhouse gas emissions will be those most affected by climate change. Climate justice, as Irina was saying, is intimately linked with human rights. Human rights, in their modern form, originated out of the horrific experience of the Second World War and the Holocaust. The Universal Declaration of Human Rights was, after all, born in 1948, directly after World War II. Yet human rights discourse has a deeper tradition, with roots in Locke's writing, the European Enlightenment, and the American and French revolutions. The human rights we now enjoy are therefore shaped by our past, reactions to slavery, war crimes, and genocide. Human rights are aimed to protect those most vulnerable in human society and to safeguard their ability to pursue a higher quality of life. In the present and the future, the climate crisis will come to reshape current conceptions of vulnerability, just as World War II did in the 20th century and political disenfranchisement did in the 18th. It is therefore critical that we push for climate rights and continue to safeguard the ideals of justice for which human rights stand. Climate change will affect us all, but will disproportionately impact low-income countries and low-income communities in high-income countries. The most vulnerable in society, whether indigenous peoples, migrants, the poor, women, the elderly, or persons with disabilities, will bear the brunt of climate change. One of the most relevant examples is found in the Pacific Island states. The people of the Pacific Islands contribute less than 1% to global greenhouse gas emissions, yet are on the front lines of the climate crisis. The threat of sea level rise, storm surges, and coastal erosion pose existential threats to Pacific Island states. Pacific Islanders' rights to life, liberty, and security of person are on the line, as are, some argue, their right to nationality, given the possibility of the islands being completely submerged. The Pacific Island states have been termed the small island developing states by the United Nations. Yet they are now forging a new narrative, coming together and rebranding themselves as the big ocean states, as they vocally push for climate justice in international negotiations. This elevation of voice and redefinition of vulnerability is a prime example of the fight for climate rights that we can learn from and apply around the world. I would now like to highlight some critical debates which have engaged the UK Student Climate Network on the issue of climate rights as human rights, and climate justice more broadly. These issues came to a head in discussions surrounding COP25, which was to be held in Chile. For decades, Chilean indigenous peoples have fought to safeguard the environment, yet their voices have been marginalized, and the Chilean government have constantly suppressed indigenous opposition to the development of ancestral lands. An individual within the UK Student Climate Network was invited to the COP talks in Chile and arranged to go. Yet a month before the talks, a debate erupted over whether he really should. Whereas he can express his opinion freely and openly, and crucially be heard and respected for his activism, Chilean activists face persecution and voicelessness. Coverage of indigenous activists in the media has often been sidelined to focus on young European activists. Again, this highlights a key contention that we must explore when looking at climate rights, on which voices to elevate in the fights for rights to life, liberty, and security. Slowly, indigenous, migrant, and youth voices, and with them the discourse of human rights, are entering international climate change negotiations. At the UN Climate Summit in September, an indigenous representative, Tuntiak Katan of the Ecuadorian Shuar people, spoke alongside the Bangladeshi Prime Minister, Sheikh Hasina, and philanthropist Bill Gates. Formal indigenous representation has been worryingly absent at the UN, yet the tide is slowly turning. 15 of the 20 wealthiest states have no timeline for a net zero target. Emissions have increased by 1.5% per year in the last decade. According to UN Environment Programme projections, On our current trajectory, we are set to see a temperature rise of 3.2 degrees Celsius by the end of the century. This situation looks a little bleak, to say the least. But all is not lost. Take the Fridays for Future movement as an example. From Fiji to India, from Germany to Chile, 7 million students and adults took to the streets in September to fight for their future, for climate justice, and for climate rights. As we enter a critical time for climate action, we cannot allow ourselves to succumb to hopelessness and desperation. Rather, we must continue to push for action, to elevate the voices that must be elevated, to safeguard those most vulnerable, and to ensure diverse and inclusive discussion on the future of the climate. There is not much time, but there is still hope. And climate rights should and must be at the heart of a transition to a climate justice-driven world.
Well said.
Thank you.
Sophie. Sophia, thank you very much indeed. May I now invite Lisa Van Halle to speak. Lisa.
Thank you. Thank you very much. I'm a professor of political science. I'm delighted to be here. I've spent the last 15 years studying human rights and climate change politics largely separately, and I'm really delighted to be here to talk about the two issues together, and really glad to see that they've made it onto the agenda. The impacts of climate change are already having a devastating effect on people's lives. This is not something that is going to happen in the future alone. The likelihood and intensity of extreme weather events, such as hurricanes and heat waves, has increased because of climate change. This impacts on the right to life. The expansion of disease vectors like malaria has been linked to climate change. This impacts on the right to health. Rising sea levels have the potential to undermine the very existence, at least in a territorial sense, of some small island developing states or big ocean states, as Sophia has pointed out. This impacts on the right to self-determination. Even action taken to try to address climate change, like the development of clean energy infrastructure, can undermine human rights when it is not done in a way that protects the right to meaningful and informed participation. So yes, climate change are human rights. But it's worth pointing out that a decade ago, the answer would not have been as clear as it is today. And I think there are several reasons for this. I want to talk about 3 of them. On a philosophical level, there is a clear divergence on fundamentals between concerns about climate change on one hand and a desire to protect human rights on the other. The subject of human rights is a field that, as it says on the tin, is concerned with humans and the rights that flow from being human. On the other hand, climate change for most of the last 30 years has been framed as a problem of the impact of pollutants on the atmosphere and the natural world. It was framed as something that would be happening in the future. It was not a topic that sat easily with the traditional individualizing, reactive, and victim-perpetrator framing of human rights violations. Second, on a legal level, a decade ago, there were 2 separate UN regimes governing these areas of global policy making, the UN Human Rights Regime and the UN Framework Convention on Climate Change. They operated very much like ships passing in the night. The UN Framework Convention on Climate Change, these climate negotiations, were largely silent on human rights until the adoption of the Paris Agreement in 2015, where a reference to human rights was included in the preamble. This didn't go as far as many of the climate change and human rights activists would have liked it to have gone. The human rights conventions and institutions have historically overlooked the linkages between protecting and respecting and promoting human rights and the consequences of climate change and some of the costs of trying to address climate change. Third, on the level of social movements, organizations concerned with environmental protection and climate change did not tend to frame the issue through the lens of human rights. Human rights organizations also didn't tend to engage with climate change as an issue. So what's changed? I think there are 3 things. The science. We've known about global warming for at least 30 years. But last year, the Intergovernmental Panel on Climate Change, the world's leading scientific body for the assessment of climate change, warned that in order to avoid catastrophic global warming, we must not reach 1.5 degrees above pre-industrial levels. It's already been pointed out, we are on a trajectory to surpass that. And we have a growing understanding of what the impacts of climate change are likely to be, and an increasing awareness of the loss and damage that it will cause. Scientists are increasingly able to attribute certain weather events to anthropogenic climate change, So more and more, we are able to connect the dots between greenhouse gas emissions, climate change impacts, and human rights violations. We have growing evidence. Second, the human rights community is beginning to take up the mantle of climate change. Some of the large traditional human rights organizations are beginning to grapple with this topic. In June 2019, Philip Alston, the UN Special Rapporteur on Extreme Poverty and Human Rights, noted that the world is at risk of climate apartheid, where the rich pay to escape the impacts of climate change, while the most vulnerable bear the brunt of the consequences of the climate crisis. In his report for the Human Rights Council, Alston concludes that human rights might not survive the coming upheaval. And he called out the human rights community for its reluctance to engage robustly with climate change. In September of this year, the UN High Commissioner for Human Rights, Michelle Bachelet, told the Human Rights Council, the world has never seen a threat to human rights of this scope. The human rights gains that we've made over the last 30 years are now in jeopardy. Finally, we see the emergence of new forms of social mobilization. This includes the youth climate strikes and Extinction Rebellion, which are movements which are much more comfortable and on explicitly drawing on human rights relevant themes, such as questions of global justice and the rights of children, young people, and future generations. We also see a huge growth in climate litigation around the world, with an increasing emphasis on human rights arguments being made in these legal cases. I think all of this suggests that the time is right for governments to take responsibility and for citizens to hold their states accountable. Paradoxically, the very human rights that are threatened by climate change are the tools that may prove most useful in holding governments to account on the climate commitments they need to make. In short, it may be the case that on a global level, if we don't use human rights, we could lose them. Thank you.
Lisa, thank you very much indeed. Now it is the turn for Sophie Marginak. Sophie.
Good morning, everyone. Thank you so much for having me. Equally, it's a pleasure to be here. So I work for Client Earth. Client Earth is a global public interest environmental legal charity. So I am a lawyer. I'm an Australian qualified environmental lawyer. And I've been working in climate change law and litigation for about 4 years now at Client Earth. This morning, I'm going to tell you about a particular case that Client Earth is supporting and in which I am the lead lawyer. And it's a human rights and climate change case brought on behalf of a group of 8 Indigenous Torres Strait Islanders from the remote and pristine Torres Strait Islands, a beautiful part of my country, Australia. So earlier this year, I was in the Torres Strait. The Torres Strait's located between the very tip of Cape York in Queensland and Papua New Guinea. And it's approximately 200 islands on which very small communities are located. So it's home to Indigenous Torres Strait Islanders. They are unlike Australian Aboriginals, but have a Melanesian islander culture. The region is a pristine wilderness. It's right at the top of the Great Barrier Reef. It is so biodiverse that you can literally see sharks swimming right up to the beach, and the children have to be told not to go into the water and pull their tails. So it's a really pristine region. Indigenous Torres Strait Islanders have been living there for 9,000 years, continuously. However, in March earlier this year, whilst they're talking to the clients and their communities and gathering evidence for their human rights case, we literally saw 3 metres of beach being taken away by a storm surge in 3 days. So we saw there was a high tide and the combination of a very strong wind from a cyclone passing nearby, and we saw the real life effects of sea level rise and erosion, and it was shocking. The locals were trying their very best to save their island by using sandbags, but they really were no match for the waves. The clients are telling us this is just getting worse year on. Some of the Torres Strait Islands are regularly flooded at the highest tides. Literally, people are walking around in puddles of water. Often grave sites are flooded. One of our clients gave us evidence about walking down the beach and actually having to pick up the bones of ancestors who had been washed away from the high tides. That's really upsetting for islanders because in their culture it's extremely important to look after grave sites. It's part of their cultural responsibility to look after their ancestors. So that's really tough for them. We heard from old people, and we heard the same story again and again, that the seasons are changing. They can't predict the weather anymore. And this impacts their traditional way of life, which is very rigid and lived by the seasons. When they see a certain tree flowering, they know that that's the time to go out and gather a certain kind of shell or fish. And those traditional way of life is lived by the seasons. Climate change is therefore literally playing havoc with their traditional cultural way of life and traditional cultural knowledge. However, the most upsetting thing, I think, from the visit was to see the children and to think about what kind of hard, tough decisions they will need to make within the next 15 years. And that will be whether to abandon those islands or maintain their communities. Now, if the islands are abandoned, which seems inevitable given sea level rise and other impacts, they will lose that ancient continuing connection to the land, and they will be climate change refugees in their own country. Now, what we did at Client Earth is we've assisted a group of islanders to take a case to the Human Rights Committee of the United Nations. The claim is under the International Covenant on Civil and Political Rights, which is the first human rights treaty that Sophia mentioned. And we've argued that climate change violates 3 fundamental rights protected by that convention. Firstly, the right to life. Next, the right to family and home. And really importantly, the right of minorities to enjoy their culture. Because for the islanders, if they're not on their land, they're unable to practice their traditional culture. And this is where I think we can see very clearly that climate change affects human rights and that climate change is a human rights issue. I'd like to just finish. I'll just read a quote from one of our clients. His name is Kebe Tamu, and he's a 28-year-old man from the island of Warraba. And he says, "We have a right to practice our culture and to practice it here in our traditional homeland where we belong. Our culture has a value to us that no money could ever compensate for. Our culture starts here on the land. It is how we are connected with the land and the sea. You wash away the land and it is like a piece of us that you are taking away from us. The impact of climate change on our culture, sea levels rising, coastal erosion, the effect of coral bleaching on our practices connected with the sea, it is beyond one's understanding." Thanks very much.
Sophie, thank you very much indeed. Finally, Scott Ainsley.
Just picking up on that theme, I remember going snorkeling and seeing the effects of El Nino and the coral just completely wiped out. It leaves what was once beautiful sea life as a bed of ash and hardly any life at all. I'm a long-term member of Greenpeace, Friends of the Earth and Amnesty International, so these themes about human rights and the planet have been key to my life for a long, long time. I promised my children that I'd fight like hell to remain in the European Union because I think the issues that we face respect no borders. So it's important that we have international cooperation and look to work together rather than create any more division to save the planet. The second promise I made to my children was I'm going to make sure I save the planet. So they're on strike today. I was thinking about not coming to make a point, but I think that there's one school child who's said that we'll strike, we'll come into school, but could we talk about the effects that climate change and climate breakdown is having on the planet? And I think that's a great idea, that they all discuss that subject, because a lot of the time they've been kept in the dark about this by probably vested interests. And I'm going to be talking about that and climate apartheid today. So, in 2012, Hurricane Sandy wreaked havoc on New York, stranding low-income and vulnerable New Yorkers without access to power and healthcare. Meanwhile, the headquarters of Goldman Sachs was protected by tens of thousands of its own sandbags and power from its own generator. During the recent wildfires, private white-gloved firefighters saved mansions of high-end insurance customers, whilst low-income people were trapped in their homes. These are not exceptions, but they're the rule. Philip Alston, the UN Special Rapporteur on extreme poverty and human rights, called this phenomenon climate apartheid. The rich pay to escape the heat and hunger caused by the escalating climate crisis, while the rest of the world suffers. The climate emergency is a human rights issue because it affects so many different areas: the right to food, the right to housing, the right to education, and many more. But these effects are stronger for the most vulnerable and those, as it's been said before, who have contributed least to this crisis. Developing countries will bear an estimated 75% of the costs of the climate crisis, despite the poorest half of the world's population causing just 10% of CO2 emissions. There are around 25 million new displacements by natural disasters every year, with small island states being disproportionately affected. A total of 227.6 million displacements by natural disasters occurred between 2008 and 2016. A 2018 World Bank report estimated that by 2050 there would be 143 million climate change-driven migrants from the regions of Latin America, Sub-Saharan Africa, and Southeast Asia alone. Efforts like Stop the Mangamese, which is about charging genocide and ecocide, have taken this matter seriously, and I joined a march through London to support them, who were calling for reparations to stop these effects in the sub-Saharan continent. And this will fuel, obviously, what happens when you have a massive amount of climate refugees. If you think that you've seen a lot of refugees to date, it's nothing compared to what's going to be happening unless we take this issue extremely seriously. And then we all know that this will fuel nationalist, xenophobic, racist, and other responses around the world, threatening to undo the last 50 years of progress and development, global health, poverty reduction, as well as democracy, the rule of law, civil and political rights. Now, this is nothing new, so clearly steps must be taken. But as Greta Thunberg has brought to our attention, we are all asleep at the wheel. The time for talk is over. Because the only positive developments that seem to come from society are the actions of our children, the school strikers, people who are standing in solidarity with them to go out and strike, and the movements such as Extinction Rebellion, who take to the streets because when government fails to protect you, what option are you left with but to protect yourself? So I think, and I've myself almost got arrested. I can't because I'm going to get the kids to school the next morning. I was asked if I wanted to be arrested at the last Extinction Rebellion protest. I said, no thanks, I've got to take my kids to school, and there's no guarantee you'll release me in time on these trumped-up charges. 40% of the global employment rely on a sustainable and healthy environment. The heat stress will reduce global working hours 2% by 2030 alone. Climate action is not an impediment to economic growth, which is often used as the reason for not taking any action. But unless we decouple economic growth from emissions and resource extraction, then I'm afraid that we're just leaving ourselves a much bigger problem to deal with further down the line. Now, the World Bank itself sees no reason that a low-carbon path must slow economic growth. Instead, reducing emissions will mitigate the economic harm of climate change by trillions of dollars. But the effects of climate change will be most visible in the future, and financial centres are not really focused on the future, are they? Our financial institutions, for far too long, operate, particularly in the City of London, where I am the MEP for the Green Party, one of our major concerns with the City of London is this short-termism, this short-term move to get profits. And we have a lot of companies that are funding, trying to keep the debate open about whether or not, climate change is actually a real thing. Or, I mean, I'm hoping that all of that is gone by now and there is enough sense in the world. But just along the road, 55 Tufton Street is a place where they do finance intellectuals to create papers that try and create division and speculation. And like the tobacco industry, it all, the more that they can keep producing and the more that they can find different markets for their products. For example, I remember the British and American tobacco saying that, it doesn't matter if we have all of these health warnings on packets of cigarettes. We'll just open up in China, where with the rule of law is not so strict, and we can just sell billions of our cigarettes to the Chinese. So this is how global capitalism is stopping any progress towards this. But as we can see, some of the World Bank, for example, is moving in the right direction. And as was said earlier on by Irina, yesterday the European Union passed this climate emergency, which is a step in the right direction. For me, it didn't go far enough because there was no firm target set in place and a timeline set in place. But we have to, as people, keep the pressure on these global corporations. But also, can I just say, as an MEP in the European Parliament, it has been shocking. And I encourage you all to listen into the plenaries. You can watch them live, to hear some of the opinions coming and the denial, total denial, and the sheer lack of information of some of the MEPs discussing the climate emergency. This is why I have joined, as one of my committees is the Constitutional Affairs Committee. I think it's clear that a lot of MEPs in the European Parliament that are not progressive probably have a conflict of interest, and it's a case of making the punishments of those conflicts of interest so severe that they think twice before they defend what is truly an indefensible position. Some of the comments that I've heard recently, I've tweeted about. Anyway, I'm going to have to leave it there because I sense that I've probably gone on too much, as my kids often tell me I do. But I'm happy to answer more questions. I've got lots more to say on London's and the financial world's complicity with not really addressing this problem quickly enough, because we all know that's where the real block is. Thanks.
Scott, thank you very much indeed. Okay, just a couple of questions and then we'll throw it out to the floor. Let's begin with the declaration of a climate emergency yesterday at the European Parliament. For those of us who didn't watch the entire session beginning to end, could you explain to us exactly what the Parliament means by a climate emergency and what you plan to do to react to it? Because the Financial Times this morning described it as rather symbolic. Who wants to go first?
Well, I don't know if it really is symbolic. But because there is, of course, a definition to a word. An emergency is something different from an urgency, which was the alternative that was proposed by parts of the House, not mine. And it may sound a little bit like splitting hairs, but if you think about it, an emergency is when you really you don't have time to grab your belongings, you run. And you take action now. An urgency is something where you think, okay, well, I put it on the top of my list of priorities. I do think it makes a difference. Whether in practice it is going to translate into concrete action, of course, remains to be seen. But we had a long debate, and there were a lot of amendments where we looked at specific targets that are ambitious but achievable. We also looked at interim targets. So I do think there is flesh on the bone, but it needs further work, certainly. It needs to be translated into action next week at the COP25, but it also needs to be enacted by the member states, and we still see too much divergence, too many national interests that get in the way.
Scott, what would you say? Could you tell us what exactly, if you could list us a couple of things that a climate emergency will spur each member state to jump in and do?
Well, the Green Party put forward their own motion, but there was absolutely no way it was going to get through. It had clear targets, more ambitious targets, with clear timelines, but it wouldn't get through because there's a real block. Out of the 751 MEPs across the 28 states, there's a huge lobby that don't particularly want this to happen quickly. So they obfuscate, they continue to dither, they continue to delay, they continue to build in what they see as pragmatic things. What I love about Greta Thunberg is that she cuts through the nonsense. The science is clear. We have 10 years to avoid runaway climate change. We've already passed certain tipping points. The political decisions we make now, and I would say that we've got less than 18 months to set in place a timeline with clear deliverable targets, with punishments if those targets are not met. Because if we don't, then people just keep kicking the can down the road. As we've seen, I don't want to make a political point, but obviously a group voted for a certain target date of zero carbon by 2030, yet vested interest groups change the opinion. And I see that happening constantly, and we don't have time to do this anymore. Even the government's interpanel on climate change says that even if we do set 2050 as a date, as the UK government declaring a climate emergency, there's less than a 50%, well, there's about a 50% chance that we will avoid those clear tipping points. Now, I'm not going to accept these odds, and I don't think anyone in this room would accept these odds. So we need to move faster, we need to be more ambitious, and we need to work together, and we can't keep having this dithering and delaying and playing about with 2045 or 2050. We have to take urgent action now. And that means that you can't say, on one hand, symbolically, we want to get to carbon neutral by 2030, and then continue supporting airport expansion or further road building. It is a no-brainer. It doesn't make sense. It's not enough to mitigate by planting trees. You've got to stop, you've reduced demand, reduce the amount of CO2 we're putting into the air. And we've got a lot of things that we want to put in place, but we are being hamstrung because this is not being seen as a climate election.
Sophie, we just heard Scott saying that we all need to take more action. Arguably, I wonder whether if you had not been born and brought up in the islands that now desperately need your help as a lawyer, whether they would have joined the dots and thought, we can stop this and we can stop the effects of this because of our people's obligations to our human rights. How aware do you think that we are that actually human rights could help us?
I think at least in the legal space, as was previously said, there is a growing recognition that climate change is a human rights issue, and we're seeing a lot more human rights-based litigation around the world. So we've seen a case in Colombia brought by a group of young people to stop Amazon deforestation. That was successful. There's a case in the United States being brought by young people as well against the US government under the US Bill of Rights. And so there are cases based on human rights popping up around the world. Greta Thunberg herself and a group of children from 6 different countries have complained to the Committee on the Rights of the Child, alleging that climate change violates their rights as children. So I think there is a big shift, as was mentioned. Amnesty International now has a comprehensive climate change strategy. So there's certainly a shift, although it has been slow. I mean, when I started at Client Earth, we would talk about climate change as a human rights issue, and in fact there was resistance from traditional human rights practitioners, and perhaps that's natural, but I think that they have now definitely come around.
Thank you very much indeed. Lisa, I mean, let's just build on that a little bit. There are cases there that are being brought using human rights, but let's think of, what are they called, the People's Climate Case from last year. I don't know if anybody, if you're not aware of what that is, maybe you could explain it. But it was a group of people who tried to use, well, they went to the Court of Justice of the European Union and they tried to take action, but they were told that they couldn't because they were uniquely impacted by climate change, and so they didn't meet all the requirements for actually being able to being heard properly. When you hear that kind of thing and you think, goodness me, I want to change things, I want to do something, and yet the lawyer or the legal system says no, what can be done?
Yeah, it's a really good question, and it varies a lot on the jurisdiction. So the case in the Court of Justice of the European Union, you know, it faces certain challenges. It takes a long time to get up to that level of court, and we know that court has been quite conservative in judgments about environmental rights more generally. Which is strange because, you know, it's governed under the Aarhus Convention, which protects in Europe our rights to access information related to the environment, to participate in decision making, and promises access to justice. So there's a real tension there, I think, exhibited in that particular case. But there are these mechanisms, these procedural rights in law and in a new agreement in the Caribbean and Latin America called the Escazú Agreement is trying to emulate that Aarhus model of these procedural rights. So we are seeing the spread of these kinds of rights around the world, but it does depend on courts and judges kind of taking that up. So.
And parliaments too. I mean, tell us a little bit more about the fact that you can have a political refugee, but you can't have a climate refugee yet.
Yes, and I think that's wrong. To me, I mean, if you flee persecution, you get a right to asylum. If you flee hunger, you don't, even though that hunger may be caused directly by the actions of governments to deprive you of your natural resource. I don't quite get that. So I am working on asylum qualification regulation in the European Parliament, and I would actually like to change that. I would like to have climate refugees recognized as political refugees and as asylum seekers. In practice, that, however, means that we will have millions and millions of these people, and we already have a lot of refugees who come because simply their habitat has been destroyed. And we cannot simply ignore that problem and say, oh, you know, you're economic migrants. No, there are not. There are people who are seeking refuge because they cannot survive, and that is as a direct result of the action of governments and individuals who are instrumental in destroying that habitat.
Sophia, you mentioned that you wanted people to save the future. How much faith do you have in the institutions, in the organisations and the companies that they're actually going to take that call seriously?
I think it's a very tough one because right now we're not seeing that action, and we need to continue to push for climate justice. Right now I don't see any sort of enough action being taken, so I can't say that right now. Have a lot of trust in those institutions, but I think we still need to push for that action and hope that the institutions come on board, see how much of a popular movement this is. Like I said, 7 million people took to the streets on the 20th and 27th of September. And so democracies and states all around the world need to recognize that and act on behalf of their people, realize that this climate consciousness is only going to continue to grow, and include that in their decision-making.
Okay, Sophia. Right, let's open the debate out to the floor. I suspect there'll be quite a lot of people who have something to say. A microphone will come your way. If you grab it, get to the point with your point, and then we'll see what we can do with answers. Right, hands up who wants something to say. The lady at the front there. Let's pop it over to you. You could introduce yourself, tell us where you're from, or if you represent any organisation first.
Claudia Sternberg from UCL European Institute. Thank you very much for a brilliant panel and discussion so far. My question would be to the lawyers and activists among you, so basically all of you. What is your advice on how you could harness the connection between human rights and climate change or the climate emergency in shaping activism? What could youth organizations do, and how can they get in touch with the right people who can help them frame arguments? And the same probably for our MEPs and MPs.
Who wants to start with that? Sophia, you were nodding.
Yeah, happily. Well, it's interesting you asked that question because I recently took part in a strike about a month ago when Salles, the environmental minister for Brazil, came to London. And it was outside Brazil House, and we essentially, I think what we did was how these kind of protests should continue to be done. Because what happened was we invited Amnesty International, Survival International, and indigenous people from around Brazil who lived in London to come to the strike. And then what was done was we had about an hour of speeches. 45 minutes of those speeches were reserved for indigenous people to talk about how the crisis was affecting them, how the crisis was affecting their families and their communities. And then we had a representative from the UK Student Climate Network. But again, we were looking at how we can bring out the indigenous voice. And then finally, to conclude the protest and conclude the speaking, indigenous rights activists read out quotes that they had collected from their families and from their communities in Brazil. And so this is really how I think we should go forward with these kind of issues and elevating the voices that need to be elevated and elevating the voices and the communities that are being affected by climate change, and not just having sort of youth talking about their future, because that's very important, but indigenous rights really need to come to the fore, and that's what we should be looking at in our strikes.
Scott, may I bring you in on this? I mean, being a card-carrying member of both Greenpeace and Amnesty International, has there been a real lack of overlap between these two campaigning ideas and groups?
I think possibly, and I think that would be something that, as a member of and Friends of the Earth, we could bring them all together. I mentioned Stop the Mangamese earlier on. It was a march by people from African and Caribbean nations that were seeking for reparations for years of raping, pillaging their land, their people. And at the time, I was probably one of the only white people on the march at the time. They're basically saying that the West and this country has built such an amazing amount of wealth by exploiting not only the land and the minerals but the people themselves. And when I spoke to a lot of white people about this, they would say, "Well, how do you possibly quantify it? Where do we end with victimized people throughout the generations?" But actually, it's a very pertinent point. And not long after then, Strathclyde University decided that, or I think it was Strathclyde or Glasgow University, one of them anyway, admitted to pay reparations for past injustices with the university built up on slavery, for example. Now, these are the conversations that we have to be having. Because actually, and it's not that you compensate a family for all the trouble that happened a long time. They're not asking for that. They're asking for a fair amount of resources for past injustices in order that they can stop or try and mitigate as much as possible against the ecocide and the genocide that is continuing to happen. So they are linking human rights with environmental rights. They are linking, they are making that fundamental transition that has to be brought together as we transition into a world of sustainability. And we must look through everything through a lens of environmental sustainability, fairness, in a world that we can, because we're all sharing a world, right? Okay, we can't just try and mitigate, like Goldman Sachs did in New York, their little bit of it, we're actually all in this. And I think that we do need to be making these links, and these organizations would be well advised, and I will suggest this to them as a member, that they do that. As London's MEP, on the 16th of December, I'm going to be holding an exchange of dialogue between a wide variety of youth movements, which mainly have left out the Black, Asian, ethnic minority community, working with people behind Stop the Magnum Easy to try and bring greater understanding between cultures, between nations, on human rights and environmental issues.
Okay, thank you very much indeed. Next question, gentleman in the second row. That's you, sir.
Sophie, thank you very much. I think you touched on something about identity. I and my land are one. A lesson I've learned only recently, and largely due to indigenous questions of identity, is that I believed, and I think it's true of many people in industrial society, that I am separate from the air I breathe and the food that sustains me, the life support system of which I'm discovering one. So that question of identity, could that be a key for bringing, as Pope Francis told the International Association of Penal Law quite recently, ecocide into the Rome Statute, along with genocide, as being two aspects of one identity?
Okay, question for the lawyers, I think. Sophie. Thank you, sir.
Thank you for your thought, and I think absolutely that generally we can learn an awful lot about sustainability from Indigenous cultures and an Indigenous worldview. In the case that we have supported the clients to bring to the UN Human Rights Committee, we did talk about identity quite a lot because that kept on coming up in our interviews. And in fact, the right to life argument is based on a broader concept of the right to life. That is that as individuals, Indigenous people must be on their land to be full people, because that simply was the evidence. It was that if they were not living on their land, then they would be a husk of a person. And so that's absolutely what the evidence was from the clients, and that's the basis of our argument on the right to life. So it's a more expanded view of the right to life, but the UN Human Rights Committee for those students of law, in general comment on Article 6, the new general comment on Article 6, does talk about the concept of life as being a fulsome and well-lived life in dignity, which is more than just being dead or alive. So that's legally, I think these issues are coming through in the jurisprudence.
Can I come in on that for 1 second? Because I think it's a really important point. We recently celebrated the 30th anniversary of the Convention of the Right of the Child, and we had invited about 200 children from across the globe to the European Parliament, and it was very interesting that it was children from the developing world, and it was children for more rural backgrounds who raised climate and the environment. And I think that many children, but also grown-ups in the developed world, and particularly in urban regions, have lost that connection. Because, if you buy your food from the supermarket, it's slightly different from when you see it grow. And when you are directly dependent on the soil that your house stands on. And education is key to that, in my view. I think we need to educate our children to somehow see that connection by sending them out to see how food is produced, but also what impact food production has, what impact their daily commute has on the environment, but also how they depend on water, and that water is not something that comes out of a tap, but it comes from somewhere else, and that is key for combating the climate emergency.
Is it just about education, though? I mean, is it something that we all try in our own small way to make sure that we do as little harm to the planet as we can? But some have accused many institutions, the EU included, as actually being slow on the uptake here. And if you have a country of 28, 27, who knows, member states who all have their different agendas, some are dependent on fossil fuels, some are driving a green agenda, you're a bit stuck, aren't you? You can't take the leadership role, can you?
Well, I believe that if you look behind those agendas, what those governments ultimately want is the welfare, I hope, the welfare of their citizens. But they are being asked to make sacrifices to a different degree. So what we are trying to promote is the highest standard of welfare that you can achieve, whilst at the same time combating the climate emergency. How do you do that? Well, I think one way to do that is to change business models from being reliant on fossil fuel to being able to operate profitably, but with innovative technology which makes them independent of fossil fuel, to invest heavily in innovative technologies which we know are there, which we know work, and give people a chance to have a rapid transition from these old economies to the new eco-economies. That needs political will, but it also needs education, and I come back to that because a lot of this is demand-driven. And we see that, for example, when it comes to beef production, if people stop eating beef, there will be less beef production. It's as simple as that in a market economy. And I'm a Liberal Democrat. I do believe that these things are demand-driven and that we should have free consumer choice, but it should be based on education, and that education has to include the climate emergency.
Thank you very much. Okay, next question. Lady there shot her hand up very quickly. The glasses. Yes, it's you. Could you introduce yourself? Tell us if you're part of any organisation, and then your question, please.
My name is Lisa Nidzalska. I'm an incoming postgraduate environmental policy student. I have another question for the lawyers. So encouragingly, as Sophie has shown, there's an increasing legal awareness that climate rights are human rights. But these are the human rights of people currently alive now. But as Greta and other climate activists emphasise very regularly, it's actually also the rights of future generations that are going to be infringed upon by climate disaster. So I was wondering, do the rights to self-determination of future generations have any legal identity? And also, maybe following on from that, does the environment in itself have an inherent kind of legal right to be safeguarded?
Okay, 2 questions there.
Do you want me to stick to that?
Have a go.
Yeah, okay.
Thank you very much.
It's a really good question. It's a really important topic. And as far as I'm aware, there is no international convention that protects the rights of future generations. We know that the UN Convention on the Rights of the Child protects children and young people, so that's the closest that we get. There has been a lot of work by philosophers in this area. So Richard Hisks has written a wonderful book called The Human Right to a Green Future, and he really points out that there's a recursive relationship between the rights of future generations and present generations. And what that means is that when we begin to take care of the rights of future generations, we're also benefiting ourselves. And so it's kind of a win-win in that way. And so philosophers have really been dealing with that, but there hasn't been anything in terms of kind of legal acknowledgement of that.
Sophie, your response to that, rights of future generations and right of the environment itself.
So rights of future generations have not been acknowledged formally in any case that I'm aware of. In the Agenda case, which was brought on behalf of unborn people in the Netherlands, the court actually declined to accept the claim on behalf of the unborn people. That they thought that was going too far, although, of course, Agenda is the most successful climate change litigation case that we've had so far. But they declined to find that unborn people had rights. But fundamentally, one of the key principles of environmental law is intergenerational equity. So that does raise the issue of unborn generations and future generations. And I also think it's actually fundamental to the definition of sustainability itself. And sustainable development, as defined by the Brundtland Report, is development that allows meets the needs of the present without compromising the needs of future generations. So inherent in the definition of sustainability is a concept of intergenerational equity. So,
Okay, Scott, you want to say something?
The Inter-American Court of Human Rights has characterized the human right to a healthy environment as fundamental for the existence of humankind, including that owed to present and future generations. But as far as I know, that is the only place in the world where this has come up. In London, we are trying to have a right to trust the air that we breathe. So we'll be looking to legislate and punishing the governments that fail to deliver on air pollution targets, which London has a toxic air problem. But can I just propose a flip to what you're talking about? The interstate dispute settlements, like TTIP, and where a company has the right to punish a country for getting in the way of its right to make a profit. Again, it comes back to what I said at the beginning, that it's almost as if in the international global stage, corporations have more rights than we do as human beings. And that is wrong. And that is what needs to change. There needs to be a power balance change or shift in order to create and live life on a sustainable planet where human rights are given more precedence than a company's right to make profit.
Actually, there was an article this morning where where auditors are being asked by big investors to take climate change more into account, because it is basically being accused big companies are being told that if you don't think about climate change as a factor, then actually that will be more damaging to your profits than any other economic threat. And I think that was the first time I read of the likes of PricewaterhouseCoopers and Deloitte saying, come on, pull your socks up. But I just wanted to ask Sophia a little bit about this, that you're all talking about lobbying governments and this, that and the other, but how much are you able to lobby private companies to say, please do something about this? You're part of the problem as much as anyone else.
Well, in the UK Student Climate Network, I can only speak of my experience, we've talked pretty extensively with the Department of Business and Industrial Strategy, so with the government ahead of the UN Climate Summit, ahead of Madrid, and will be part of discussions ahead of Glasgow next year. On the private sector, we don't actually do too much work, apart from... actually, we don't really do too much work with the private sector.
Why not?
It's just not something we've really had a focus on, because we are really pushing for action from the government. That is our focus. We want a Green New Deal. We want reform to the education system, as Irina was saying, which is very, very valuable. We want votes to be lowered to 16 so that the young people can have a voice on the future. And we want more inclusive discussion from the public on the climate debate with the government. So those are our 4 demands. We're not necessarily yet looking at companies, but that could be a space to grow in the future.
Is there anybody here in the private sector who would like to sort of add their voice to this today? I promise we won't say anything nasty to you. Just who might have something to say about the responsibility that corporations are now beginning to feel.
Actually, I would, if there's nobody else. There is a gentleman there.
Gentleman at the back, brave soul. Let's bring a microphone to him. Please introduce yourself. Tell us where you're from and what your thoughts are on this.
Tony Czarnecki, Sustensis. I've been in sustainability for 25 years. I've read most of the IPCC reports. And if you look into them, 2 of the most recent only have mentioned geoengineering. We have 2 sides of the equation. We are almost reaching the tilting point of the climate change. We really need to act very, very fast. The European Union will dedicate about 10 billion euros a year for all countries to decarbonize. We would need perhaps 10 times, 20 times more from the European Union alone to dedicate it to geoengineering. There are around 100 methods which are environmentally friendly, they wouldn't damage the environment, that would decarbonize the atmosphere. Why is so little being talked about in the European Parliament, and not to mention within our own government? So that is my question.
I think the ball's just been thrown back into
Yes,
your court.
and I think that's an excellent question. I'll come back to that in a moment. I just wanted to say one thing about business. So before I was elected, I was actually working for an international organization representing the ICT industry. And I think there are two sides to this coin. It's businesses, yes, can play a very destructive role, as we have seen with particularly some of the global mining corporations that are involved in some horrendous environmental crime, but also human rights atrocities in countries such as Brazil, Mexico, but also Venezuela, and the Philippines and others. And yes, we need to crack down on this. We need better regulation, and we need indeed criminal laws to cover that. The flip side of the coin is that businesses can also play a key role, actually an indispensable role, in developing the new technologies that we so urgently need, particularly when we're looking at energy production in a sustainable, decarbonized way. And yes, I agree, we need to actively support rather than over-regulate or penalize these attempts by the private sector in order to develop these innovative technologies. And I think you're right, we need to make more money available to those efforts.
Okay, thank you. Next question.
Sorry, can I just come in on
Yes.
a couple of clarification things? In 2015, the fossil fuel industry and its products accounted for 91% of global industry's greenhouse gas emissions, and 70% of all human-made. So this is where the pressure has to be most applied. In terms of your question about auditors looking at companies, there is a new measure, rather than the FTSE 100 index, there is a new measure to look at environmental, social and governance index, so that you're not looking, so that a company, that if it has a long-term plan to look sustainably through the lens of sustainability, and it is measured on economic, social, and governance index rather than just its profit. And there are some companies that are doing this, and the index has been adopted, particularly on the Scottish Stock Exchange, but it's got to be ruled out everywhere else. That for you, as in people that are making decisions to invest your money, if you look at the index on the ESG index rather than the share index, then you will be investing in a company that's looking at sustainability rather than short-term profit maximization.
Okay, I'm keen to get a couple more questions, and you had your hand up very quickly there, madam. Introduce yourself,
Yes.
where you're from.
My name is Emily Shirley, and I'm part of the Climate Litigation Working Group. And this question is really for the lawyers, but anybody can pitch in if they like. In essence, I think human rights itself, just to comment quickly, actually the right to life has to be future generations inherent. You can't just have life now and then life finished up for the next generation. So I think that's an argument that needs to be made. But the question is really, we have XR right now, people going to court who are actually facing charges, have been imprisoned. Surely for the lawyers there must be some case we can bring for representing the XR people, the thousands of XR people that have been who've been arrested and offending themselves, and I have one next to me now, Lady Barclay. There must be something there that we can defend using human rights grounds, so the right to life, and also the fact that they're being arrested and accused of getting criminal convictions for actually just trying to get their voices out. So it may not be we're living in a sort of an urban jungle rather than in an indigenous jungle, but we are people nonetheless, and our voices are not being heard, and there is a human rights argument that we made. So I guess I would say, do you think this maybe is a Client Earth possibility for Client Earth or some lawyers to help these exile people bring a case that actually brings up the Article 2, the right to life argument?
Sophie, is there some work coming your way?
I think that's an interesting question, Emily. And I know that there is actually a really great legal team working for the XR activists, and they are getting quite a lot of support from a huge number of volunteer lawyers from across the UK that have come forward to lend their skills and services to XR. I think there has been some success in defending criminal charges on the basis of necessity, which has been brought up, I think, in France and in the defence of some of the XR activists and other activists in the UK in the past. So potentially is the answer, and I think that's certainly an argument that ought to be considered by those criminal law specialists.
Okay, next question.
Just maybe very quickly, I started out by saying, and I want to reiterate, that the criminalization, often under anti-terrorist legislation of environmental activists, is something that we have been fighting against in a number of countries. And I have to say, shamefully, that includes a number of EU member states. And I can give you loads of examples where this has been the case across not only Eastern but also Western Europe, and definitely has to end.
Okay. A couple more questions. Quickly. Madam. Tell us who you are, where you're from, and, well, you know what to do.
Hi, my name is Charlotte Diebekenke. I'm actually the proud sister of Sophia.
I thought I recognised it.
I'm here on 9th Immigrate, actually from Harvard University, where I'm involved with Harvard Undergraduates for Environmental Justice and Divest Harvard. We actually just staged a big protest at the recent Harvard-Yale football game, which gained international news coverage. And so my question is about divestment. I know we've talked about Divest Harvard's goal is to, it's calling upon our institution, which is has a lot of influence on the global stage, to divest its $40 billion endowment from its fossil fuel holdings. And I know we've talked about ESGs and investing in technologies, but I wonder what your thoughts are on divestment as a way to encourage fossil fuel companies to make a quick transition to cleaner energies.
That question to Lisa.
Yeah, I think it's a really great campaign to be a part of. I think Harvard Divest took a legal case. It was one of the first legal cases on divestment, so there's legal action being used there, kind of a range of tactics. It's a really admirable thing. I think it's a really powerful mechanism, and I'm really proud to be at an institution, UCL, which committed this month to divesting from fossil fuel. So definitely can have an impact on a powerful way on the private sector, which we were speaking about.
It is the question of making positive justice, isn't it? Because I think a lot of people feel, when asked about climate change, that they have to stop doing things. We have to stop driving a car, we have to stop doing this, stop flying, etc. But I thought of an example of I don't know if anybody's seen that enormous power station in Copenhagen, which they have turned into a ski slope as well, because they put all the refuse in such an enormous space, they can actually let the people of Copenhagen ski down it. And it was that idea of making climate change actually a positive thing that lets us able to do more things, as opposed to letting us stop doing things. How much does the European Parliament think in that way?
Yeah, I think it's a brilliant idea. First of all, it's about awareness building. And I think whatever you do has to be directed not sort of towards despair, but really towards hope and what it is that we can positively contribute, what we can do. And you're right, it shouldn't be just sacrifice. Although I do think that we all need to make a degree of sacrifice, be it in reviewing your pension fund, or be it in simply maybe not eating that steak that you would love to have, or not taking this long-haul flight. But there is also something very positive about engaging. There are examples of, for example, recycling, which can be wonderfully creative. And we've seen loads and loads of examples of this. You can reuse your everyday things. I mean, I'm a huge fan of charity shops. I think everything I wear today is from a charity shop. So that's another. I'm not joking. It's true. Ask my friends.
We believe
you can not only save money, but you can have a fun and cheap way of shopping and giving and recycling your clothes. But you can also become aware and just build awareness about where things come from, supply chains, and just to be a little bit aware as a consumer. You may find that buying becomes not only more responsible, but also more fun.
Okay, final question from the audience. Gentleman over there. Introduce yourself. And
My name's John Birch. I'm a retired member of the diplomatic service. And I'd like to ask, is there a relationship between climate change and population growth? And do we have a moral responsibility in the West on this subject of population growth?
what exactly are you asking us to do or not do?
What I'm saying is, in Western countries, on the whole, we've stabilized our population growth. But in the developing world, populations are growing. And I just wondered whether, as climate activists, we, and you and the panel, have a moral responsibility on the question of population growth. Is this a challenge to us? What should we be saying to the developing world, where populations are, through agriculture and through industrialization,
Thank you for that. Lisa, you want to begin with that one?
This has been a debate going back, I think, to the 1970s when the Limits to Growth report first came out. For me, what I think about our moral responsibility sitting in the global north is to take responsibility for the emissions that we have benefited from since the beginning of the Industrial Revolution. It is to raise the voices of those in the global south that are going to bear the brunt of the impacts of climate change. So when I think about moral responsibility, that's where I focus my attention.
Okay, quick answer. Yep, Sophia?
It's actually a debate that has been that has occupied the UK Student Climate Network for quite a long time now as well. Because on the one hand, people argue, if you come with this argument that Western nations have stabilized their populations and all of the economically underdeveloped countries have not, and that they should, it can lead to so-called eco-fascism. I think if you're not taking the correct approach and allowing people's voices in these communities to come out and to simply impose top-down, you need to cut your populations now. I, however, think that population growth, the more people you have, the more resources that are consumed. So I think, yes, we do need to control population growth, but in a very, very inclusive way that facilitates discussions with those communities in which population growth perhaps needs to be controlled slightly. I think the perfect example you can find is in Kerala, this very progressive state in India, who have essentially cut their population growth dramatically by investing in their women and highlighting gender equality and getting more women into education and investing in childcare so that women can go into jobs. I think that is the ideal way in which you can look at population growth and climate change.
Okay. Totally agree with that, but would also add that if you look at emissions per capita and consumptions per capita, of course it's the developed countries that have a far, far bigger footprint. I think Scott mentioned the statistics of contribution to the actual climate emergency. So we cannot really push that responsibility from ourselves. And totally agree with Sophie, what you do. Of course, there is a problem with population growth, and the way to combat that is through education, and that's one of the things that I think the development policy of the European Parliament is also very much engaged in.
Okay. I agree with the panel.
Okay. Thank you. Thank you very much. The final question to this lady. I know you've been eager to talk. Introduce yourself, please.
My name is Dido Barclay, and I'm from Thames Blue Green Economy, which is campaigning for management of the water across, which we're not doing across the Thames Basin at the moment and across the UK. Yes, I was arrested, and I'm dealing with the case at the moment. And what I'm really interested in is I'm really shocked at how the law is not able to really deal at a higher level with climate change, and so I've been going into it quite carefully. And what I've realised, the government is deliberately and being ignorant on climate change, which passes down through the lawyers and everything else to the legal department. And I'm pleading not guilty because of self-defence and because I'm not a criminal, and the government is clearly a criminal, but that's another story. And so when I spoke to a judge friend of mine, and I said, look, how can we object to the judges who don't know about climate change and don't know about ecocide? And what she said, if a judge doesn't understand the concept of ecocide, it's his job or her job to learn. And it struck me, can we then object to when it comes to Crown Court, or if it goes up to the Supreme Court? Are these going to be ways which can actually work And because of ignorance, what the other thing which is I've seen online this morning actually, if BP spend £46 million on lobbying, and now it's climate change emergency across the country, is this not, perhaps I've used the wrong legal word, seditious? Is it not illegal and terrorist act to actually fight against something which is actually happening to the country?
Thank you very much indeed. I'm going to give that to Irina, and then
just
Lisa.
very briefly, because you touched upon two topics very close to my heart. The first one is, you said it, not me, that our government is criminal. I'll leave it at that. The second one is about disinformation, because that's a topic that I've been dealing with for quite a long time. And this is political disinformation, whether it comes from, private industry, from the government, from vested interests, or indeed from influence from abroad. Through social media. We have not dealt with this, and it's, to me, the biggest threat to our democracy today, distorting of facts, very often financed through dubious sources and with huge resource. We need to get to grips with that. My view is that this has to be a combination of legislation, of responsibility of those who act as channels for this disinformation, and crucially, education, again, media literacy, but also the way to scrutinize and to fact-check these kind of lies that are being spread.
Lisa, what would you say to?
Yeah, I totally agree. It's a great point. And, one of the audiences we need to educate are judges. And I absolutely agree with that. And there was a case in San Francisco, I believe last year or the year before, against some of the fossil fuel companies. And the judge asked for a climate tutorial and brought in climate scientists to try and learn about some of the issues that were being dealt with in the case. And obviously that takes a very progressive judge to kind of acknowledge what they do not know, and we need to see more of that. I think it's also important to caveat that we see law and human rights as part of that, as part of the answer, but that mobilization is fundamental, mobilization and education.
Finally, so that brings us to the end of our panel discussion, but there are a couple of minutes where we can ask every single one of our panelists to come up with about a minute's worth of your top thoughts or your top hopes or a fix if you had one. There will be a clock on you. So no easy ask, but I'm going to go in reverse order. So Scott, what would you say?
We have to divest. If the climate were a bank, we would have bailed it out by now. I think that the rule of law has been overextended by the current incumbent in number 10. People were arrested under Section 14 the other week. It was trumped up charge, taken to the High Court, and they were found that the police had overextended their powers. We have to reclaim our democracy right now in this country, and we have to sort out the rest of the world. And I suggest that the way that we sort out the rest of the world is to deal with inequality throughout the world, and to deal with this apartheid, this unequal distribution of resources throughout the world. And that means that we've all got to make individual decisions, but we've all got to lobby. We've all got to lobby the companies that we invest in. We've all got to lobby our representatives, because we need them to act. Their empty words are not enough.
Okay, thank you very much indeed, Scott. Sophie?
So just my final thought is on the law. I think people sometimes see the law as some fortress and also some kind of magic fortress that is a certain way that can't be changed. The law isn't real. The law is just a reflection of our social values and expectations. That's all. And it will change. So we see the school strikes and these student movements. Law is also slow to catch up. It normally comes behind social movements. In the civil rights movement, for example. So with the social movement around climate change, the law will get there, but it is a little bit slower.
Okay, thank you very much indeed. So, Sophie? No, Sophia.
Sophia, yeah. So I think ultimately what we need is a shift to climate justice in our thinking. We need our world leaders to think and go into climate negotiations with climate justice in mind, to safeguard the communities that are most vulnerable to climate change, to elevate the voices that need to be elevated, and to have inclusive and diverse discussion going forward on climate action.
Thank you very much indeed. Irina?
Well, I think the title of this debate is really summarizing what we brought out in the discussion, is that we can no longer separate between what we classically think about human rights, right to life in particular, and the rights to a planet where we can live. If you think about it, it's obvious we have to translate that now into a legal system that makes sure that everybody's right to a habitable planet is protected.
Finally, Lisa.
We all have the right to a stable climate, but human rights aren't just about law. They belong to all of us. Human rights discourse can be very, very powerful. And finally, we need to remember to take human rights-based approaches when we take action on climate change.
Okay, thank you very much, and thank you very much to my panelists, Irina von Wiese, Sofia Dievik-Henke, Lisa Van Halle, Sophie Marjanak, and Scott Ainsley. And thank you all for coming. Apologies, we have overrun a little bit, but it was with the intention of making sure that as many of you could be heard as possible. If you have enjoyed it or have a comment, please do tweet at Sakharov UK or at EPinUK. Thank you very much indeed. Lunch is now served, and I have been reliably informed that it is meat-free. Thank you. Thank you. Thank you very much. Thanks.